Okay, in this presentation, I want to talk about Max Abrams' 2006 work, and maybe I'll allude to some of his later stuff, but mainly we're focusing just on this one paper. Okay, Max Abrams, Why Terrorism Doesn't Work, from International Security in 2006. And um, Abrams in this paper, which I think is fairly accessible. I like Abrams' work because he focuses on things I personally think are important, but he approaches things from, hey, let's look at all the groups, and so he basically identifies 28 T groups, terrorist groups, from 2001 on, and this is considered to be the complete set, right? So he's not looking at a sample, he's looking at the complete set. And he notices just at a descriptive level that groups accomplish their objectives only 7% of the time. And, this is one of the things about terrorism that it makes a point that's kind of elementary, but, we focus on the splashy groups, the groups that achieve some success. But there's just a crap ton of terrorist groups out there that get wiped out. The first time they use violence, they die. The governments come for them because they are fighting, David versus Goliath. Goliath steps on David most of the time. You just remember the one time the slingshot hits, the rest of the time, smush. And so that's, a big thing about these. We tend to focus, we have a very biased view of, there's a big selection bias in terms of the groups we're aware of and we think of. And when you go and get all of them, right, and look at them overall, totally different story. He looks at and this is something maybe I drunk the Abrams Kool-Aid a long time ago, but he looks at their objectives, and he basically says, he's not as interested in he will talk about methods, but he sees in terrorist groups a difference between groups that have limited, like, territorial objectives, where, hey, we want you to leave, right? Or we want to be separate. And so Hezbollah trying to get the United States and Israel out of, Israel had already gotten out in Beirut, trying to get the United States and France and the other powers out of Lebanon. The various groups trying to get Israel out of the occupied areas, the Tamil Tigers trying to separate. All of these groups are seeking territorial gains. Of course, Hezbollah, groups since 2001 aren't in that. I'm reaching out to other examples. But he notes that limited objectives were more likely to be achieved, right? That they're 3 out of the 3/8, right? 3 out of 8 were successful. I think that's what of groups with those objectives. And that there were no successes for groups with maximalist ideological objectives, right? And so he's making that distinction between groups that say, look, we want you out of here, as opposed to groups that are like, well, we want to bring back, the true Islam, and Al-Qaeda with its desire for a caliphate, the jihadists, who have these he describes them, maximalist objectives, right? And so this is where his, thinking starts. And so let's look at what he comes up with. Okay. Speaking of the objectives, right? He says, look, here are groups, right? And we have groups that have limited objectives that he sees as being territorial. We have some success and some failures, right? And I think 3 out of 8 might be about right there. And then we have the groups with maximalist objectives, and and then the idiosyncratic objectives are other groups that have just things that are unique to them and don't really fit. So what we see, though, notice, though, like I say, there are a lot more maximalists in general, right? And actually, they're more idiosyncratists. than groups with idiosyncratic objectives than limited objectives. That's interesting, I think, in of itself. But here he makes a point, and one thing about this is, look, this is independent dependent variable, right? His dependent variable is, as opposed to PAPE that I talked about in the previous thing, very clear: success, right? And so he's saying what characteristics of a group are more associated with success. So here we have an independent variable, the selection of objective, the hypothesis, that makes a sense. And here we just have a histogram, we just have a picture that allows us to eyeball the data. And yet this, there we go. Okay. This would be, by the way, considered quantitative analysis because we're looking where, it's just we have categorical variables, right? We have 3 nominal types of objectives and a measure of success or failure, a dichotomous, 0, 1, right? It's success or it's failure. And, there's no numbers or math involved, but here we go. So keep that in mind, that you can do this kind of thing, right? The methods in this paper are nowhere in no way beyond you guys, even probably before you take 6601. So it's not a bad paper as an exemplar too, that, hey, this is what you could do for your capstone eventually, or something like this. Okay, target selection. And here's a big thing, right? He says, look, he distinguishes between what he calls civilian-centric terrorist groups versus guerrilla groups, right? And he kind of says, look, groups whose attacks on military and diplomatic targets outnumbered their attacks on civilian targets were the only ones that had any success, right? So here he is avoiding, he's got the idea of civilian-centric versus guerrilla. And it's not all or one, it's, do you more often attack civilian targets than these other things? And that's an interesting way of defining it. And he says, look, only the groups that, tend to act more like guerrilla groups are the ones that have had any success. And civilian-centric terrorist groups never achieved any objectives, even if they were limited. Right? And so there's, here's his picture. This is his big data analysis. Yay. But, he really, he has doubled down on this right now. He's going on to write more papers and books. But this is a very interesting view, right? And he's saying that, look, the target selection and success, you just don't win, right? If you have maximalist objective, and if you think about it, the story here is very straightforward. If you have maximalist objectives, well, you don't achieve them because they're crazy, right? If you have limited objectives, well, you might achieve them. But even if you have limited objectives, if you go about killing civilians, you don't make it. Right? The civilian-centric groups, even the ones that had limited objectives, although we have to say the number of those is small, nevertheless they don't pay. Notice though, well, how does that jibe against PAPE, right? PAPE noticed that, hey, most suicide bombing is, the suicide bombers are aimed at territorial objectives, right? That was one of his things. So, what Abrams is saying about PAPE is, well, your suicide bombers tend to be in, for whatever reason, they tend to be focused on limited objectives. And so, yeah, we see that working. And then the question is, did you, instead of talking about the fact that you were suicide bombing, did you look at what the suicide bomber was doing? Right? Was the suicide bomber attacking a civilian target, or was the suicide bomber attacking, as I mentioned in the other things, the USS frickin' Cole, right? Or an embassy, or a military checkpoint, or what is the target here? And when you look back at things, right, you talk about groups having success, right? Hezbollah is, and it might not be part of this data set if it was since 2001, but the Hezbollah is traditionally talked about as being one of the successes, right? And they go back to the suicide bombing in the Marine Corps barracks. And Abrams' point was one limited objective: get out. And frankly, the U.S. was not planning on staying there that long, right? The U.S. had gone in to get Israel to cover the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, and then got sucked into some peacekeeping, and you're pushing on an open door with the U.S., right? The U.S. did not want to be there. It wasn't in national interest. It was not something that people had agreed on that they really wanted to do. It kind of happened. And this is where people start talking about mission creep, right? You just showed up. The U.S. showed up to, actually, if you don't recall, the U.S. showed up to separate Israel from the PLA, the Palestinian Liberation Army, right? Not the People's Liberation Army of China, but the PLO had an army back in the day, and the Israelis, had defeated it, and so the U.S. came in and covered the withdrawal. They said, all right, we don't want you killing all of these people, but we have to do something. So the U.S. and France and I believe Great Britain, was it Great Britain as well? There were a number of powers that went in and said, we will separate Israel from them and they can withdraw and get on ships and leave. And then they did, and the U.S. was almost out of there, and then fighting erupted. And what are you going to do? So the point, limited objective is my point. But also they weren't blowing up civilians, right? And I believe Abrams here talks about, hey, when you blow up civilians, people see you as extremists, and they don't believe that your objectives are limited, or that, and so that, the idea of you will be more successful when people believe they can give you what you want. One, what you want isn't that bad, and two, they don't think you're crazy and going to want more, or, that's the gist of what he says. You need to appear to be reasonable, right, in order for people to give in and to make concessions to you. And the two things. And so the whole suicide bombing issue, though, is, it's the thing that Abrams is pointing out here is it's not important whether or not the attacker gets killed, or, in fact, you would think showing that we got people who are willing to blow themselves up is a statement of resolve, right? The question is, what are they blowing up? Are they blowing up a bunch of kids, right? My God, that's bad. No one likes that. Or are they blowing up guys who should be able to take care of themselves, right? Soldiers at checkpoints, warships, that sort of thing. Things that, are reasonable targets. And that is what Abrams says, that target selection is a very important thing. And in fact, he's gone on to double down on this, and he has a book, Rules for Rebels, and I have a video there's a video of him explaining this all, but and that's he's taken it a bit further. But here is the beginning of the work, and there's a paper that I think is kind of a nifty little paper.